Hey everybody, it's your old pal Andy with a couple of announcements before this episode. First of all, I'm actually not on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio, so I asked our editor, Matthew, to send me the edit ahead of time so I could listen to it and maybe still come up with a cool intro. And instead, I found that I am grossly misrepresented in this episode and I have to explain myself preemptively. So this is the book club episode for Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, which I think we announced maybe 9 months ago on the show. And the reason it has been so delayed is that I simply could not read the book. And you'll hear Anthony and Parker say that I'm not on this episode because I didn't like the book. And that's not true. I'm not there because I didn't read the book. And I already get called a blowhard in the comments of this show enough when I'm talking about something I feel very knowledgeable about. So there's absolutely no way I was going to be on the book club episode for the book I did not read. You are in much better hands with Anthony and Parker. And yeah, I'm profoundly embarrassed that I'm a grown man and I couldn't read a book, but I don't know what to say. I tried really hard and I just couldn't do it. And I felt like it was silly to delay the episode any longer. So yeah, I'm covered in shame about it. And that's that. Second of all, our 300th episode is right on the horizon. I am shocked and horrified to say. And Anthony and I are hoping to do a Q&A episode. So if you have any questions for us, magic-related or not, please send them to mail@luckypaper.co with episode 300 question in the subject line. Try and keep the questions as short as you possibly can, and if you're up for a challenge, try and ask us something unexpected. You know, we don't know what you people want to hear, so if there's something you've been wondering, send it to us at mail@luckypaper.co, and we will hopefully get enough questions to do an interesting Q&A episode. That's it for announcements. Take it away, Anthony and Parker.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm Anthony, and I'm here with Dr. Slippery Parker Lamascus. How are you doing today, Parker?
I'm doing great. Dr. Slippery is my new supervillain name, I think. But what are my superpowers besides slipperiness?
That's up to you. Sintering... Okay. What else do I remember from your thesis? Accumulation of zirconia on ball bearings. That's what I remember.
You know, you remember just about as much as I do at this point.
We are here, unfortunately, not today with Andy Mangold because he didn't like this book, but we are finally doing our next episode in the series of book clubs, talking about The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman.
You know, not everybody has to like every book. And that's what book clubs are all about, is like 3 people walk into a room and one person's like, I didn't like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a very fun book club if everybody walks in and it's just like, yep, book was good, 5 stars, thumbs up, let's go home. Which, I'm a little disappointed that Andy's not here to talk about it, even though he didn't enjoy the book, because, yeah, I think that is part of the spirit of a book club, and I think is actually one of the most normal things that can possibly happen, is that somebody does not finish the books, in my experience, but we also have to give everybody the right to concede from book club at any time, just like a game of Magic the Gathering.
That's so true. And, you know, speaking for Andy maybe a little bit here since he can't defend himself, I will say that one of my high-level thoughts of Don Norman, The Design of Everyday Things, like maybe this is a spoiler, but Don Norman is deep, deep in the pocket of big jargon. This man has coined so much thought technology in so few pages, like I didn't think it was possible. But it feels like every page he's defining something or proposing some thought technology to talk about design. And it was honestly a little overwhelming. I think you kind of have to be able to step past that to kind of extract something useful from this, especially for like game designers like us.
I would say that he's not in the pocket of deep jargon. I think he is literally the consultant that people with big pockets go to invent jargon.
Fair enough, yeah.
Which is kind of a different role, I think.
He's the jargon factory for big jargon or something.
The jargon consultant. So, this is nominally a podcast about Magic the Gathering, so I'm curious, why do you think we chose this book, Parker?
Well, I think we have me to blame for that, but, you know, Don's goal is, I don't know, how would I summarize this? He's trying to argue that every day in our lives, the devices and things that we interact with, when we struggle to like turn on our oven or adjust our car seat, that's not because we're stupid or distracted. It's often, just as often, because the object is poorly designed. And so he's really speaking to the designers of those objects, engineers, industrial designers, and saying like, hey, look, when your customer misuses your device, that might be on you. That's not on the user. And in a similar way, I think that maps very cleanly to game design where, we're very used to thinking as cube designers, like, are my players doing this wrong? Are they, not noticing my archetypes? Or is this my problem? Is this something that I can address through design? And so I think there's a very natural synergy there between the two pursuits.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you brought up all the jargon because I think that the jargon is, especially when we try and translate this, I mean, if we want to game design or cube design or whatever other creative pursuits we want to, that jargon to me feels like it gets a little bit in the way, but I think that the underlying principles, I think, do apply to like any creative pursuit. I really think about game design and writing and what I do professionally, making websites. All of these kind of deal with the same issues of psychology and communication and making things that people can understand. So I think all of this is super interesting and super broadly applicable. I'm really curious in general to hear more about your perspective because this was the first time you read this book, correct?
I've actually read it once before, but it was a while ago. Yeah, it was a while ago, and so I'm reading it with a lot of like fresh eyes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I read this book when I was in college in, let's call it, 2010, probably a little bit earlier than that, and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. It's such a funny like way to reflect on how much my just thinking about the world and my values have changed because it just feels like such a different book, but it's easy for me to sort of flip back and be like, oh yeah, I was in this headspace where I thought about things in a pretty different way when I first read this. So it's kind of, for me personally, an interesting little time capsule. I feel like Andy had a lot of frustration with the book. Well, I feel like I shared a lot of his frustration with it, and I'm disappointed that he's not here because I would like, I'm interested in him to defend like what didn't work for him. But for me, I feel like it was that so much about this book or so many of the ideas in this book are now just like completely embedded and intrinsic in the way that I see the world. Like these are just things that I absolutely take for granted. And because of that, I initially felt some of the same frustration, I think, of like, well, yeah, obviously that's the case, but why do you have to frame it that way? Why do you have to like add this extra detail that is confusing or kind of counter to it or couched in a way that I find kind of frustrating? And I think if I was reading this with fresh eyes, I would be like, oh yeah, this idea of mappings or affordances is like really powerful ideas. And sure, maybe there's 50% of it that I'm not really into, but reading it for this like second time with a lot of distance in between, I'm just picking up on the stuff that's kind of frustrating. And like, it took me sort of some active effort to be like, oh wait, okay, these ideas that I think are just sort of taken for granted, they actually were introduced by this book. So I really should give him a lot of credit for that. But yeah, there was a lot of additional stuff. If I took away the stuff that now feels very important and the stuff that I took away as being meaningful, there's a lot of that jargon that I found pretty frustrating as well.
Maybe we should start there. Like, if you had to say what are the 2 or 3 takeaways from this reading of the book that were positive, how would you describe those?
I don't know. I mean, the other thing is that my just perspective on design and how design fits into the world has just changed and become so much more cynical that I'm also just like, this book doesn't matter anymore. And it's like, as much as I think some of these things are useful and like good ideas, they're also ideas that I'm just like, this is not the conversation we need to be having because like design has not been employed in the way that I expected in my optimistic days of my youth. But I will try to get over that a little bit. I think the idea of mental models is one of the big ones, and that's just, and I guess we should say, you didn't have to read this book if you want to listen to this episode. We're going to try and explain what's going on, but if you did, you can follow along with this a little bit more and have more context to the specific examples. But he introduces this concept of mental models as a way that a human understands the world and then uses that knowledge to interact with it. And he especially uses that in relation to technology and the interfaces that we design to allow people to interact with technology that is potentially more complex than they fully understand. So one example he talks about is operating a refrigerator. And you might have a mental model that is, we have 2 temperature controls and there are 2 sensors and 2 compressors in your refrigerator that control the freezer and the refrigerator compartment separately. And that can be a fine, useful mental model that you can use to separately control the temperature of those 2 compartments of your refrigerator. It turns out that mental model is not correct. It doesn't actually map to the way that the refrigerator actually works, which is by having a single compressor and then adjusting how it directs the airflow to adjust the temperature. But that idea that that mental model can still be useful even if it's not correct is, I think, sort of a powerful idea. And maybe more than that, like a lot of mental models of technology are to some degree accurate, and creating interfaces that sort of hint at or imply what kind of mental model of the system you should have so that you can then operate it as intended.
As I was reading this, I think one thing that really helped me was like, how do I take this design, jargon that he's introducing and put that in the game design world that I'm used to and where I plan to use these ideas. And so mapping, it was like, we think of the stack, it's a really complex and abstract thing to explain in Magic. You've often probably tried to explain this or heard it explained like first in, last out, right? And so you'll actually like lay the cards on the table in a stack and it's like, okay, now we're going to resolve them from top to bottom. And when the rules changed, when damage was on the stack, that was much more confusing to explain because it wasn't as intuitive from this model, right? Another like real world example for mapping would be like folder icons on the desktop of your computer. It's like, first of all, we call it a desktop to talk about like its relationship to the physical desk. And then the folders are like, oh yeah, this is where I store my files, just like in this file cabinet that's a physical object. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, totally. And I think that he's using, again, a ton of jargon that he's largely invented to talk about mappings and whatever. I don't even remember all the jargon, so I'm going to skip past it. But like, I think maybe a cleaner way to describe it is just analogies. And another example he gives is the adjustment controls for a car seat that are shaped like the seat. And it's like, okay, I can feel this knob and this is shaped like the bottom of the seat and I can move it up and down to raise and lower it. Or push this sort of button that's the shape of the back of the seat forward and back to adjust the angle. And that's a really clear analogy that people can take and translate. And it's interesting that same kind of idea of analogies also then analogizes to these kind of totally artificial systems like a game, and the fact that we can introduce maybe concepts that aren't even intrinsic to the mathematical system of a game of Magic, but use this physical system of the set of cards to describe the stack. And I mean, I think that's very funny how actually on Magic Online or on Magic Arena, they have the ability to say like, okay, this effect like damage you mentioned, or, a copied effect or a triggered ability. They can also then just artificially create this card and say, well, here's this representation of this physical idea of a card and put that on the stack, which makes it easier for people to understand. I then see people do that in real space where they're playing with physical cards, but they're trying to explain a complicated stack interaction. They'll say, okay, well, I'm just going to grab this card from my sideboard, put it upside down, and use this to indicate the triggered ability that's also on the stack. So it's funny how that like experience of playing in the digital space that gave us the ability to do stuff you can't do in real cards then kind of translated back in a funny way.
Yeah, I wish I'd thought of putting the cards upside down for the stack. I never, like, it's so hard to explain Fiend Hunter and Cloud Shift or whatever when you only have the two cards.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if we almost need like extra, in some cases, just have some extra token cards just to be like, now, this is my KCI mana ability that I'm putting on. Well, you don't put the mana ability on the stack. I've already dug myself into a hole.
See, and that's where this like mapping idea can get us into trouble. In fact, it's one of the reasons that KCI in particular is such a confusing combo, is that it breaks our traditional mappings that we've built up as Magic players. Again, this happens all the time in the real world. Like if you go to a hotel or whatever, and the hot water and the cold water like knobs on the sink are reversed, or the way to like insert the stopper in the sink so you can shave or, fill up the sink. If those things don't map onto what you're used to at home, it's so confusing. And all of a sudden it's like, do I even know how to wash my hands or, whatever? Showers. I like when I'm staying at someone's house, I frequently just like ask them just to be safe. Like, hey, how do I turn on the hot water? And like, I know I could probably figure it out, but I don't like stepping into a shower only to realize it's cold. So this mapping is like, again, how we navigate the world. And so often it's subliminal, but Don Norman is kind of bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I think is kind of the key takeaway that most people will take from this book, is just this idea that there's so much like pretty bad design in normal physical objects around us. And he classically cites the example of doors, and the fact that doors, especially in like big fancy buildings, not necessarily just your classic doorknob you have in your house, but when you're entering into the lobby of a hotel, it's like, well, here's this knob or here's a door that doesn't have a knob, it has a big push panel or a pull bar or all these like more complex interfaces, and often they are designed to look elegant or look, stylized in a certain way. So you end up with like a door you need to pull that has a push bar on it. And it's like, well, technically I can use it that way, but that's not obvious and can be extremely frustrating. And I mean, this is maybe one of the other things that kind of hit me in a weird way reading this book decades later, was I was literally like, while reading this book in a hotel and could not figure out how to turn on the shower. And I'm just like, Jesus, like this sucks so bad. Like this was what I was so optimistic and excited about as a teenager, was, wow, design is this like incredible tool that we can use to improve people's lives in like really basic, simple ways. Just like, let's make it easier to know which knob connects to which burner on my stove, and how do I turn on the windshield wipers, and how do I turn on the shower? And I'm in a hotel just like, this is still just so stupid. Like, I still don't know. And it's like, it sounds like reading that you'd be like, come on, just go figure out how to turn on the shower. It's like, there's not that many ways to interact with it. It can't be that big a deal. But it is. Like, just looking at that knob, I'm like, there is no obvious way. Like, it doesn't have a paddle that indicates there is one way to push it. It doesn't have a grippy part that indicates I should hold it in a certain place. It was just this like really modern looking, thin, symmetrical bar with no features. And I'm just like, well, I could push this a bunch of ways. And I don't know. I guess the worst outcome of it is I could feel the knob was loose because enough people had just pulled on it in the wrong way that they were physically damaging the knob. And it's just so frustrating that we just live in this world where design is not a priority.
I think that's really interesting. And like, of course you're frustrated. That's a really frustrating thing to do. But I just moved to a new apartment and my wife and my roommate are like interacting with the knobs on this
You're just sitting in the corner of the room reading this book, just watching how everybody's interacting with all the knobs in the house.
I mean, a little bit, because like it's so hard to know which knob turns on which burner. So frequently I would just like overhear like, I did it wrong again. Or like I would hear these like noises of frustration as people were turning on the wrong knob. And it's like, that's not on you. That's on the designer. And that's actually maybe my favorite thing from this book is, you know, Don Norman is speaking to your classic like 1980s pocket protector sporting engineer who's like, you know, got this very rationalist view on the world and is like, I'm just going to interact with my device from first principles and derive how to turn on the shower and derive how to turn on the stove. That's not really how humans work. And I think cube designers, if we happen to get like real pro tour brain in a derogatory sense where we're like, I don't know, you just got to derive everything from first principles and how dare you use heuristics and like simply be better. And that way you'll understand my cube better. There's that mode of engaging with feedback from your players, but Don Norman is like putting his foot down and saying like, rather than blaming people, we ought to look for ways to change the system to reduce error. Humans are not machines. We are like creative beings who are good at adapting and good at, you know, interpolating and extrapolating from insufficient data. So don't ask us to be perfect every single time. I mean, another example would be like cube rules enforcement level at these local cube tournaments. I love this. At the first CubeCon, you know, it was brand new and the judges were like, okay, so you're here like you're at a Pro Tour qualifier or a Grand Prix. And, you know, if you make a mistake with KCI, we're going to give you a game loss or like, you know, some other.
Well, that might be a little bit extreme, but
maybe not a game loss. But, you know, I did have some conversations.
You said you put the, you activated the chromatic star and so it's in the graveyard now. Sorry.
Right, that kind of thing. And the truth is that all these players are interacting with these cards for the first time in some cases. That's not necessarily the designer's fault, but we adapted the system to, you know, be kinder to the humans who are in the room just trying to play a game. And that's been such a huge quality of life improvement with these local cube tournaments, is being able to be like, yeah, just take it back. It's fine. We don't even need to call the judge. Like we can if you feel bad for the take back. But let's just figure it out. We're just here to play a game. That's been my favorite thing with this reread of this book.
That's actually a great point, and I think that got lost a little bit for me. But the fact that he does have this like pretty specific audience, which is not necessarily, I mean, maybe the first time I read it, it was a career that maybe was a possibility, but it's definitely not me at this point, which is, yeah, this like, you're an engineer, you're designing this fancy new knob for a faucet, and the engineer sort of needs to be told, like, don't design it weird, design it normal, because people, you know, have a busy day, they're doing the dishes, they're taking the kids to soccer camp, they're trying to cook dinner, they just got home from work, they have to do their taxes, I gotta do my taxes, all kinds of stuff, and it's like, be humble and just like don't think that everybody is going to sit down and engage with your faucet as this like incredible work of art that is going to be their total focus of their attention. And that's so funny, given like his whole tone throughout this book, that humility actually is part of the thing that he's trying to get at here.
He's an authority on humility in this book, which is like just a funny little blend.
Yeah. I mean, something else that's funny about this book, since the last read, for me, he rewrote it. This is a second edition. I'm a little bit disappointed that I couldn't find my original copy of it. I think it didn't survive some move. So I'm like a little bit unsure what is me reading the book differently versus what is actually literally different in the book. And I would not be surprised if a lot of his tone has shifted because it's been a decade, or, you know, maybe it was longer, maybe it was 2 decades between the first and second writing of this book. And he had a lot of success, like literally was the consultant for Apple and a whole bunch of other big companies on design. Yeah. And maybe that inflated his ego in a way that was very frustrating to me.
I do want to talk about like two particular kinds of error. And again, this is the thought technology king we're dealing with. And so he breaks it all into like these little discrete components.
I gotta say, and this is not because I have a big ego that Don Norman is going to be listening to this podcast, but just because of past experience where authors of books we've talked about have in fact listened to the podcast, I just want to say, Don, please turn off the podcast. This isn't about you. Just don't take it personal. This is for entertainment purposes. We're making an entertaining podcast. Jesus Christ, this guy can just make so many lists. It just drove me insane that he's like, here's a new concept. This concept is in 7 components. And then the paragraph starts, the 2 components of this element. And it's like, what the? Stop making lists of things. Just like talk normal. It was so, that aspect of it, the fact that every new concept he introduced, he had to split it up into 7 components, just drove me insane.
I kind of envy you that this registered and bothered you, because like having spent like 12 years now in professional engineering world, that's just the water we swim in.
Interesting. So this is another, just like, this is an academic text. Like, take it in the spirit it's written is kind of where you're from.
It's a professional text, that kind of thing, where it's like, this is what you would see at a conference or like a continuing education workshop or lecture. It's the kind of information that you need to be discreet enough to communicate it to whoever's like, your grunts in the industrial design department, put it into a like succinct form that you can talk about during your all hands meeting at the beginning of the day. It's that kind of thing. So like, for example, he says there's 2 kinds of errors. There are slips and there are mistakes.
These words are, again, in all caps because they are his coined terms of art.
I didn't write that part down. I don't like co-sign the jargon itself. I don't want this to be a Baneslayer Moldrifter kind of thing. And maybe that's another reason we're soured on it. But like, I just want to read these couple of definitions just to kind of get a sense of this kind of human error that Don is talking about. So a slip is something where he says the goal is incorrect, but the execution is flawed. So you remember that legendary like misplay on a modern VOD where a player plays Pithing Needle, and that says, name a card and its abilities can't be activated. And the player says, I name Borborygmos. And their opponent is like, are you sure you name Borborygmos? And the guy's like, yes, I'm sure. I want to name Borborygmos. And the joke is that Borborygmos is not the same card as Borborygmos Enraged, and only Borborygmos Enraged has an activated ability. So Pithing Needle did nothing, right? This is a slip error where the player had the correct goal. They knew Borborygmos Enraged was going to get activated, like reanimated and activated, but the execution was flawed. We do this all the time as humans. Like, I'm trying to pick up my noodles with my chopsticks and I drop a noodle. Like, it's a slip.
Literally a slippery noodle.
Yeah, in this case, Dr. Slippery strikes again. The other kind of error is a mistake, according to Don Norman. A mistake is where the goal or plan is wrong. So in Magic terms, like you are trying to decide who's the beatdown. You decide, hey, I'm the beatdown right now. And so you make some correctly executed choices based on that. You start attacking more, playing more aggressively. And then you find out, wait, I was not the beatdown. My plan was wrong. And that's a human error. And so like these kinds of things, I think ought to give us cube designers a lot more humility when talking to our players and when our players mess up, essentially. Messing up is inevitable in Magic, and I think rather than expecting our players to be perfect, expecting them to be like these Pro Tour robots who never make mistakes and or like these superhuman levels of skill like Kai Buddha or Reed Duke, instead assume that they will make an error. So I think it's better to assume they don't know the intricacies of KCI combo or how Cloud Shift interacts with the Fiend Hunter, split abilities versus Banisher Priest. Just that extra humility, I think, is going to be the thing that I keep thinking about long after I've forgotten the particulars of the jargon.
But do you think these terms are actually useful? Like, I understand his core concept when he's talking about interacting with stuff in the physical world. It's like, first, I'm going to mentally create a plan. And sure, maybe often that plan is going to be sort of happening implicitly without conscious sort of acknowledgement. Like, my plan is, I'm going to turn on the shower. And then there's the execution of, I'm going to grab it and turn it in the way that feels most natural, and that might fail. There's those clear differences in the planning versus execution phase. Do you think that applies to Magic where it's like a fully mental exercise? I don't know if that delineation is as obvious to me.
So I think Don Norman's biggest thought technology in the entire book, which is like this loop of design.
That's a great point, that like he's talking a lot about the psychology of the way we interact with things, but then he also does go into a little bit of, well, how do we design, given that we know that? And this iterative loop is a big part of that.
Yeah, I might have called it the wrong thing. I'm talking about...
please don't use the wrong term.
We as players, as Magic players, have a goal to win the game. And we have an opponent, an adversary who's like trying to stop us from winning the game. And to do that, we have to evaluate the board and then execute a plan. And so that's this loop that he's talking about. He calls it a gulf of execution and a gulf of evaluation. So parsing a board state would be like evaluating, trying to figure out who's the beatdown. And then the execution is, how do I play the right spell first main phase so that I get the combat boost, but I save enough mana to bluff, and second main phase maybe play a second spell if I don't need to, if the bluff isn't called. So I do think there's some execution in Magic, even though a lot of it is in planning. That said, the specifics of the jargon, like if you're having trouble like diagnosing a problem, then the jargon can help break it down a little bit and be like, oh, actually, this error that I'm trying to diagnose is more of a slip. Like it's just going to be a kind of thing that happens. The execution was flawed. And maybe my solution should therefore be just be a little more generous on the take backsies during game night. Whereas if it's a different kind of problem, the solution might be different. If that's useful, then great. If it's not useful, I think we can ignore it very freely. I'm just kind of playing fast and loose here with the jargon.
Sure. So, I mean, as a cube designer, I guess if you're trying to translate his sort of methodology very directly, do you think it's useful to look at the types of different mistakes that your players struggle with and use that to inform your cube design?
Yeah, I think it's a fun exercise. And I think we should be honest that like so much of cube design is just entertaining yourself when you're bored at work or like, you have some free time on the weekend. Overthinking it is part of the fun, I think. If that's you, then yeah, it can be fun to like think really hard about whether this is a slip or a mistake according to Don Norman. But I think it's enough to just be like, hey, I'm going to relax and I'm not going to expect my players to play perfectly. If that's your only takeaway from this, I think it's a good one.
Yeah, to me, this also obviously touches on something that we maybe harp on a little bit too much on this podcast, which is just complexity. One category, I guess I would put this in the slip category, is just doing something wrong because you didn't understand the card correctly. It's like, oh yeah, this divides damage but cannot target players, or this actually enters taps, which you didn't notice. And really complex cards can lead to a lot of slips. And that's like, I don't know. It's also funny to translate this to game design because when I'm turning on the stove, I just have one simple goal of turning on the stove, and the less time I can spend trying to figure that out, the better. With game design, we're like intentionally creating friction and tension, and we don't necessarily want things to be as easy as possible. If like the game was boiled down to just a coin flip and we determined a winner, like the goal is not to determine a winner. The goal is all of the decisions you make in between. So it's actually like improving on those skills of avoiding those execution mistakes, which is actually kind of this ultimate goal of game design.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because I think it's, besides this human error part of the puzzle, it's my other biggest takeaway, which is that games are intentionally bad design in some ways. If you're interacting with a device or a car, you want it to be effortless to be able to turn on the car, know how to turn on the windshield wipers, shift gears, etc. And if you get into like, well, this is another common experience, like getting into a space age looking electric vehicle or, a really new car model when I've been driving a really old junker car. It's like, how do I even open the dang door? Like the handle I can't see. I'm not sure whether to push it or pull it, or like it's like got a zero silhouette relative to it's like sunken into the door somehow. That's just another real life example. But ideally, as a designer, you're like, I want to make this as frictionless as possible. Well, game designers instead ask, how do I add friction on purpose in order to create a fun challenge? And so like, if we're going to keep using this car example, instead of driving to work as efficiently as possible, I'm going to create a really loopy track and then we're going to race to see who can drive this intentionally difficult course with the most skill and speed. I love that realization that emerged for me as I was reading this, where I was like, wait a second, game designers actually do want some bad design. As Don Norman, like bad product design is good game design in a way.
Yeah, I almost wish we had like some better terms to use here. If only we had a little more jargon. But yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think that like reflecting on what are those different types of challenges is really informative. So it's like, I win or lose this game. Was it because of a random event, a die roll? Or was it because of me correctly sussing out some hidden information that my opponent knew that I did not know? Or was it because I just misunderstood what the options were in this game? And I'm going to have a very different reaction. I'm going to have a very different emotional experience based on what type of failure that was, or what type of event led me to win or lose this game. Which is, I wondered, it's also been a bit since I read this because Andy took a while to decide that he was not going to read the book. No shade. Obviously, you can concede at any time, including a distant point in the future. That's one of the any times. But it's like he's talking a lot about sort of the rational experience of how do I understand an interface? How do I understand the way that I move through the built environment? He's not really talking about people's emotional experience as much, which is this other big component of game design, obviously.
I also found it really interesting that like some of the things Don Norman was talking about, I was like, no, I actually do want low friction in game design, even though like a game is where you voluntarily accept needless obstacles. I don't want needless obstacles in parsing the game state. You know, like, yes, it would be a needless obstacle to have 10 cards on the battlefield all in a different language, and some of them are textless cryptic commands or whatever, but that's not really the kind of needless obstacle I want. That feels like homework, whereas like a needless obstacle that makes the game more challenging and fun is the fact that my opponent has blockers and now I have to make a combat decision. Or a needless obstacle might be I have to decide where to, target my lightning bolt, or like which mode to use on my modal spell, and that decision is maybe needless. Like we could have designed a magic card that did all three, or that, was so good that it didn't need a choice. But the fact that I'm making the choice is fun. Another example might be like, again, KCI. It is a needless obstacle to be able to like put together 3 or 4 or however many cards to create this value loop. The problem is like the execution of that combo is such a big obstacle that it's only fun to a very small minority of Magic players, like the real sickos, and it's just totally incomprehensible to, I would say, the majority of Magic players.
Yeah, I mean, this is honestly one of the things, or sort of making me think about one of the things that I love most about Cube, is that if I'm playing Constructed, that's kind of table stakes. Like, yep, there's this combo in the environment, you kind of have to know how it works, and there's maybe this like really niche experience that is very delightful for the one person that discovers that combo and figures out how to make it work, but most people are not engaging with the combo in that way. In Cube, especially the way that we play Cube, you're engaging with combos in a way that is like, if people don't know about them, they just kind of don't come up and it's fine, and those moments of discovery can be really exciting and delightful when they do come up in those very, very rare instances. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's another thing that he does touch on a lot is sort of this idea of expectations. And we talk about that a lot. And I think it's probably, something that I learned from this book probably is that so much of the way that people react to an experience is just based on their expectations. Some other big concepts he brought up is this idea of constraints. So, looking at a doorknob, it's like, well, I can twist this doorknob. I can't necessarily maybe looking at the actual door frame. Clearly, there's a piece of molding that prevents the door from being pulled a certain way. So that implies the way that the door is going to be pushed. Are there some other examples of constraints that you found compelling?
Let me find in my notes where I wrote down the particular definition of this piece of jargon. I think, some interesting constraints in Magic are things like damage that only targets creatures versus damage that targets players or anything. Things that your cards can't do, like it only counters non-creature spells or it only counters creature spells. And those constraints imply certain things, right? Like the fact that Stubborn Denial counters a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1 or unless you have a really big creature, that implies some things about how you might build the rest of your deck to maximize this 1 mana counter spell. Pair it with Death Shadow, and then you have a really big creature, and you also have a creature that's really good to protect with a counter spell. And like Creature Burn is like, oh, okay, I can use this to control the board to build for a late game control deck, or I could use it to gain temporary board advantage for an aggro deck. But I'm not going to be able to ignore the board and just burn the player. So yeah, I think constraints are all over Magic. They're like, in fact, so common that it is almost hard to separate them from the background noise of Magic. But it's a big part of what makes the game satisfying. I actually just found this in my notes, and Norman says that constraints simplify memory. It's easier to remember things that are more constrained than it is to, for example, knowing that most lands tap like as part of their ability makes it easier to memorize the lands. And when you encounter a rare land that like does not tap in order to use its ability, such as the storage lands from Time Spiral block, they have an activated ability that you pay mana into, but you don't tap the land as part of the cost. That's much, much harder to remember correctly. And in fact, it's much easier to get wrong because all the other lands are constrained in one way, and this land is unconstrained. Another example would be like how much easier it is to reassemble a piece of IKEA furniture where all of the fasteners only go into one hole. All the fasteners are different sizes, so they're more constrained.
I love that example because it would be so easy, again, as this like hubristic mechanical engineer to say like, let's make every fitting for this the same. So we only have to put in one type of screw, but actually saying like, no, let's make this a little bit asymmetrical so that it can only fit together one way makes it much, much easier to, accomplish the goal and assemble a piece of furniture.
Contrast that to like a Lego set where all the pieces technically interface with all the other pieces, and it's like, I really need the instructions for this. But with a bed, it's like, I lost those instructions 2 moves ago, and I just keep putting this thing back together based on memory and the constrained fasteners.
It's interesting you sort of touched on this idea as well that he talks about, which is, of course, capital, in quotes, emphasis, bold, knowledge in the world, which is this idea that a lot of the things that we know, we only kind of know because we put stuff out in the world. And if we were put into a totally unconstrained environment, we might not be able to remember the things in the same way. I love this example of showing a chessboard to a chess master that has just random pieces on it and asking them to memorize it, and they just can't do it. But if you show them a piece, a layout that actually is part of a game, and hopefully this is a real thing because I don't have a citation for this, a board layout that is part of a game, they can sort of use their constraints of the way that board state came to be to memorize it very easily. I was just thinking about this the other day because I was just trying to recall what one of my opponent's deck was at Shoebox, and I was really struggling, and then I sort of walked back from, okay, in the last play of the game, it was really relevant that I drew a grafted war gear. Why was that relevant? Oh, it was relevant because they played a 3/4. They had a siege rhino. And then immediately I was able to not just reconstruct what was their deck, but like what was every single card that was played from that game. And it's just such a bizarre experience to go from my memory is totally failing me, I don't remember anything about this, but then you start applying these constraints and this sort of narrative of, well, why was this card relevant? What was happening in the board state? Did they play on the previous turn? And everything kind of reveals itself.
That is so interesting. Another example he gives in that regard is coins. Like, I don't know which presidents are on which coin off the top of my head, and I don't know what other information is on a coin, like which side is the year on, what is on the backside of a dime. I don't even know. But if I reach into my pocket or my, coin bag or whatever, I can easily reach out the correct coin, like without even looking. And it's because that knowledge of what's the difference between a dime and a penny is encoded in the knurled edge of the dime and the different sizes and thicknesses and weights of these metals, which I think is really interesting. And actually, when I spent some time in Japan this fall, I had that experience firsthand. And this is where I was reading Don Norman. So it was like very front of mind where I was using all these yen coins and, it's a different currency. Like I'm having to do this conversion in my head of how much dollars is this. But it was actually quite easy because all the coins were different sizes and even all the paper bills were different sizes. And so I knew at a glance, like, oh, the bigger bill, bigger denomination. And it made it a lot easier to just like pay for lunch, having that knowledge embodied in the world.
Yeah, that's a really cool concept that in a lot of cases, you don't need to understand perfectly what a $1 bill looks like. You just need to know enough to distinguish it from the similar features. And it's funny you brought up that example of Borborygmos, where if there was only a single Borborygmos card, that would have been an unambiguous way to identify it, even if that wasn't the complete name of the card. But only because we are operating in a world where there is a card named just Borborygmos did that issue come up. So yeah, I don't know what to do with that exactly, but it's just like, it's so interesting that, yeah, in so many cases we might think we might understand a thing in a very complete way, but really we've just learned enough to disambiguate it from the things that are most similar to it.
I think, to me, we're kind of talking around, like, reasons that humans might not be very precise. Like, I don't think about opening a door because the doorknob only lets me open it one way. I don't think about turning a doorknob because it only turns one way. But in the absence of that signifier, if there's not a knob, it's just like this minimalist thing. I'm like, am I pushing on the hinge or am I pushing on the part that's supposed to turn? Just understanding how these like quote unquote human errors often just arise from the way the environment is built, or in our case, the way that the cube is designed. It might not be that your players are bad. It might be that you're using morph and disguise, which play similarly but very differently at the same time. There's probably other examples for that. Like you're using old template burn cards that say target creature or player, and you're using new cards that say any target to mean also planeswalkers. Those kinds of errors actually often arise from humans are always imprecise. We're always looking for like creativity and adaptability rather than precision. And all of a sudden, there's this card choice that requires this sudden precision that I'm not used to needing to supply.
Yeah, that's such a cool example, and I think that really speaks to a thing, I don't want to call this a mistake, but like a little bit of a trap that cube designers can fall into is that often we might try to make an environment more approachable or more understandable by simplifying things. And you might say, well, I'm going to cut out this whole card type or this whole class of cards or cards from a certain time period, and like all the removal is just burn-based. I don't know, that's maybe a weird example, but the core of it then is like if you put a bunch of burn spells together, you've simplified it in one sense by focusing on one type of card, but you're actually making it a lot harder to disambiguate between all the nuances. And like burn spells are particularly very complicated because, yeah, there's like templating issues, but also can they target players or not? Or, yeah, I mean, there's just like a lot of nuance there. Is it going to have a triggered ability to exile, things like that?
Yeah, sometimes Singleton is, a generator of those kinds of slight confusions because Incinerate looks really similar to Lightning Strike, but actually there's this one line of text that usually doesn't matter, but sometimes matters a whole lot. Yeah, it's all over the place, I think, in Cube. Another, maybe implication of this is that, I wrote this down in my notes at one point, that Splinter Twin is in the eye of the beholder. It doesn't exist unless the player knows it's possible. And this is speaking to Don Norman's idea of affordance, which he calls a joint relationship between the object and the user. Essentially, what I'm saying is that you can add a combo to your format, but unless players know how to use it, it doesn't exist. Unless your players are skilled enough to recognize that the thing is possible and then put together a deck where that combo or that synergy is maximized, you might as well have not added it. And of course, you can do the thing where, if your players aren't getting it, you can build that deck a couple times and beat them with it. But that's a little less emergent than building something in the first place that players know how to use or can easily, put that together.
There's a really important point that you mentioned in there, which is that so many of the constraints that we're talking about are just cultural. And Don talks about that as well, how there are certain constraints that are just physical, like the shape of the door jamb. I'm just not going to be able to pull this door a certain way. But there's a lot that is just based on our expectations and the sort of information that people are bringing to the table. And I think with card games, you sit down and you play with a child who has never played a card game before. Sure, there's certain stuff you can do with the cards. You can put them on a table and smoosh them around, and they have two distinct faces that you can flip between. There's stuff that is really just intrinsic to the physical nature of the cards. But then if you're teaching somebody who has played some card games before, there's so many other constraints that are there just based on cultural experience. And the idea of, okay, we have a deck of cards. The deck is going to get shuffled. You're going to draw a card per turn. These are all things that just come very naturally and kind of form constraints that the game is built around.
Aces are typically the high card. And if you ever teach a game where aces are low or another number is high, it's really hard to make that stick when you're teaching the rules.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about the stuff that is kind of exceptional to Magic. I think that mana costs are kind of a hard thing to grok initially because they're just a little unusual from, a card that you're expecting to see okay, this is, 1 through 10 or a face card. I think one other concept that I'm sure I took from this book or came to me indirectly from this book was this idea of learned helplessness. Basically, the concept here is just that people get taught the idea, and I think of it almost more today as taught helplessness than learned helplessness, because I feel very cynical about the way that technology has been deployed against people. But people just get into this zone of, oh, well, it's my fault that I can't use this piece of software. It's my fault that I can't use this, whatever it is, this technology, and then internalize it, and then don't necessarily try as hard, aren't comfortable exploring. And this is something that I certainly grappled with growing up with my mother trying to use computers. And it's at a certain point, it's oh, you just are unwilling to explore the menu because you've been taught that you can't do this. And I think that's really disappointing and frustrating. And I wonder, is that something that you ever see coming up, this idea of learned helplessness in either cube designers or Magic players?
All the time. As much as we've been ragging on Don a little bit for the jargon, I do think his heart is in the right place of he's totally unwilling to blame humans, the users, for their mistakes engaging in design. What happens when we turn the wrong knob on the stove a few times, or when we accidentally, mess up a computer menu, hit the wrong hotkey or whatever, we start to tell stories to rationalize what's happening. And we say, I don't get this kitchen. I guess I'm not a good cook. Or this is more common with computers where it's I'm not a tech person. I just need help every time. And in game design, happens all the time when people are Magic's too hard for me. And I think this often happens with the people that don't show up every week because they've already quit the game, or they've already decided that they prefer Slay the Spire that's single player and nobody can see them make mistakes that are embarrassing, or, they prefer something else where they win more. But essentially, it's so easy to start telling a story where it's like, I'm just not a games person. I'm too bad at it. I don't get it. Games are too hard or complex for me. Or in Magic, like, I'm not a control mage. That stuff is too smart for me. Like,
I just don't know how to win with Jace the Mind Sculptor, so I'm going to take Restoration Angel.
Right. That kind of thing. Like, I'm too dumb to play KCI. I know the deck's open, but I couldn't possibly. And that one, you might have a point. But but that kind of thing is all over the place. And you have to be really careful and attentive to like notice those things, because once somebody starts telling a story about it, they'll stop giving that feedback because they're acting out the story. They're acting out the story that they're not a control mage. And if you missed the one time where they like had a horrible time with a control deck, then it will be hard to address that.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really good point for cube designers, is that this learned helplessness is a huge source of interference from the kind of feedback that you're getting. A player's not going to tell you, oh, well, I had a bad time with this, because they maybe just like expect to always have a bad time playing against stacks. So they might just skip that part of the feedback. And I think that, encouraging players, I mean, if you're looking for feedback on a cube, encouraging players to try to unlearn some of that can be beneficial.
I also think, one of the reasons complexity matters is that the first couple times you engage with a cube are so important for forming a story. I mean, I can't tell you how many cubes, I'll just confess a little bit, that like at the first, second, and third cube events I went full random and I said, I'll play anything. And I ended up in some, I'll call them clown shoes cubes, positively. Like, they're doing creative things.
Speaking of jargon?
Yeah. But like, I didn't have the best time, I'll confess. And like, I felt in some cases that I wouldn't be capable of having a good time without multiple reps. It's a short cube event. I didn't have that much time, and Keydrone Network only pairs you to the same cube once, so you don't get to have a repeat. And so, I've started telling myself the story that I'm not really a clown shoes cube person. Like, I want vanilla Magic. And I simply don't select them anymore at cube events. It's nothing personal, but I've just learned that I have a better time when I get to play normal rules.
That's interesting, and I feel like I've heard specifically the meme of, oh, well, I didn't understand the assignment. And in fact, I have felt myself saying that as well. And I think that, that can kind of lead you to a place of just being like, well, I didn't get it, so that's it. It can be kind of a thought-terminating phrase, but like, you can take the time to sit back and be like, okay, well, what was it that I didn't get about this? Like, what was the resource that I thought that was going to be most scarce that I focused on that ended up not being true, or some other assumption? And it can be a little bit difficult to stop yourself and be like, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper, but can lead to you then having more fun if you try to draft similar environments in the future.
Absolutely. And to your point, the first time I played 100 Ornithopters, it kind of brought me back around on Clown Shoes cubes, because so much of that cube is discoverable. Like, it's possible to sit down for just 5 minutes or, less as you're shuffling the packs and think about, hey, what does this mean that all my creatures are 0 mana with 0 power? And then you're able to navigate the draft successfully.
Yeah, the doorknob is not hidden at all. It's like, here is the prompt.
Right.
How do you win with Ornithopters? And that isn't the whole thing. That's not the whole conceit of the cube, but it is something to latch onto and get you started.
And so the reason all this jargon from Don is useful for us, as much as we've kind of glided over that, is that the first time you engage with a cube is the best opportunity to form a narrative about, what's possible in that cube, whether you liked it, whether the challenges were fun or extraneous and discouraging and too much, or the wrong kind of challenge. It might seem like, we talk about complexity a lot, but I think the truth is that complexity is one of the easiest things you can do to ensure that somebody's first experience with your cube sets them on a good trajectory instead of a discouraging trajectory where they say, I don't think cube is for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it all just comes back to expectations.
I think we've hit a lot of the Lucky Paper buzzwords.
We tried. We got to get all the jargon in. There's one part of the book that I really just want to drag Don about. So he's created all this jargon, which, sure, we can argue about jargon is a thing. It changes the way that you talk about stuff. It gives you sometimes the positive effect of, now here's a clear thought that we can anchor on and have a conversation on.
Yeah.
But it can also be frustrating. It can be alienating if you aren't familiar with the jargon. It can be misleading if just that concept that you're trying to codify is not necessarily the most useful. But he has, for better or worse, created a lot of jargon, and he has this like fake conversation between a designer and mentor, who I'm going to call the mentor Don, and the mentor says, oh, well, I'm trying to create an affordance, and the mentor says, oh no, well, you're not creating an affordance, what you're creating is a signifier, use your words correctly. And it's like, Don, you invented these terms a decade ago, and now people are not using them the way that you expect, and you're creating this like literal straw man conversation where you're just not like communicating a thing of value to this student or this designer. You're just communicating to them, you're using my words I invented a decade ago wrong. Naughty, naughty. It's so fucking embarrassing. Come on, Don. What the hell was this part of this book?
That part's a little tough. I think as a counterexample...
this is for entertainment purposes. Don, I'm sure you're doing great.
As a counterexample, recently the author Cory Doctorow coined the word of the year in 2024.
Was it enshittification?
Indeed it was. And he coined it and, it has a very like kind of rigorous definition. It's his theory of platform decay, and it involves a lack of regulation, a lack of worker power, a few other things that I'm not going to be able to remember right now. But of course, people have just been using this. It's been, adopted by the internet because it's a great word, and using it in all kinds of ways he doesn't intend. And he's like, yeah, when you put a word out into the world and people pick it up, like, I think that's awesome. And if someone takes that and thinks, I wonder what that really means, and looks up its origins and finds, my explanation of why unregulated tech companies are really bad for society, it doesn't matter that the other person used the word wrong. In other words, a descriptivist position on language, which I appreciate.
It's respectable, and it is honestly difficult. So great job, Cory. Well, I expected to go more on just like a tirade about how design doesn't function within capitalism, and how everything that I thought was about, design being an opportunity to improve people's lives. Just, it's not the way it is deployed at all in our society for reasons that are really depressing. But I didn't get into all that, so great.
If you want to get into that, then read Cory Doctorow's Enshittification.
That's honestly perfect. So, as we have to do at the end of every book club episode, this is the real issue now. We have a challenge because Andy's not here to help us pick the next book. So, we've created a horrible feedback loop here.
I think we should maybe defer that to a future episode, and maybe we can announce it next week or something.
Okay.
I have some ideas. I have some books I've really enjoyed reading. Maybe I'll just mention them.
Hit us with a short list.
So, I just finished 2 books by W. David Marks. He's a culture writer in Tokyo, and he wrote a book called Status and Culture. And then he just came out with a book called Blank Space, A History of Culture in the 21st Century. Both of them have been really, really fascinating. Maybe a little more tangentially related to game design. I think it's more related to the culture that we have in Cube and why some of the things we view as status symbols are the way that they are, and why Cube is such this like ever-flowing fount of creativity. I think it speaks more to that than it does how to make your cube better, but I've really enjoyed them recently. Who knows if those will be the next books we discuss, but in the meantime, if you're bored and want something to read, check out your local library for W. David Marks.
I just finished a book that Andy has mentioned before, Blood in the Machine, about the history of the Luddites and sort of parallels between the Luddite Revolution and the sort of contemporary situation with Silicon Valley. And it was, I agree with Andy, it was maybe a little bit longer than it needed to be, but super fascinating book. Did I enjoy it? I don't know. It made me feel angry. So that's a thing.
I think sometimes books that are a lot explanatory are not necessarily the same thing as, making you feel good, but still useful. But it's definitely one of those. It's on my list.
All right, well, we will defer our next book choice. And if you, listener, have any suggestions for a book that we should read, reach out to us on, Discord is probably the best way to actually contact me.
Me too. And if we got any jargon wrong, definitely don't let us know. We don't want to know.
No, do let us know. And know that you've been baited for engagement for defining affordances wrong or whatever. And on that bombshell, I think that is the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for everybody who tuned in. All the music is produced by DJ James Nasty. The show is edited by Matthew. Sorry about all the editing errors because Andy was upstairs playing with his Bluetooth headphones, which interfered with the recording. Hopefully the listeners were not aware of that. All the magic cards that we didn't talk about, both Barbarigmoses, are designed by Wizards of the Coast. The books are written by Don Norman, and the podcast is produced by reading books and talking about microphones is what I wrote in my notes, so we're sticking with that. We're going to talk about microphones. Parker, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
Thank you for the gift of reading and talking.
2 of the best ways to think about stuff.